Okay, chapter 4 is the chapter formerly called language, is now called verbal communication or communicating verbally. Certainly goes hand in hand with chapter 5, which is the nonverbal chapter. However, I decided to place it with listening because I think speaking, which is obviously the verbal dimension, and listening go hand in hand and are really important to look at both sides of that same conversation. So that's what we're going to do here in this chapter. And I have lots of different videos in the learning unit that will help you get a lot of illustration on this. So for now, we're going to get a lot of content and get through it relatively quickly. So first, when you look at verbal symbols altogether, it's important to define what language is, which is that system of symbols that's used to convey meaning. It's important to understand that that has a lot of different dimensions to it. People can study pragmatics, which is how it's used. You can study semantics, syntactics, how it's structured. Grammar, of course, has a lot to do with how it's used or combined. Encoding and decoding, typically speakers or senders are the ones that encode, and the people who receive or interpret are the decoders, and they're the ones to extract the meaning out of what is said, out of the words. Other attributes of verbal symbols, there are many. Words tend to be symbolic. They merely are representations for something else. If you have ever felt the inadequacy of language, maybe you're trying to convey everything that you feel inside of you for a particular person, and you're using the word love, and you're very frustrated at the tiny little box that this four-letter word love really is, and you've experienced the symbolic and in some ways limiting aspect of language. Language does evolve. It changes all the time. Words are very powerful. People have fought many wars over language. They have killed themselves over language. You have had your feelings hurt over language. You have had, you've been on cloud 9 because of somebody's language. So what comes out of your mouth is extremely powerful. The ability to destroy or to build up. And certainly, I don't know about you, but that absolutely has me thinking about a lot of the sort of biblical principles in terms of the tongue and the power of the tongue. Meanings for words can be either denotative or connotative. Hopefully you're familiar with those two words, but if not, quick review. Denotative is the dictionary definition. Connotative is the more subjective one. So the denotative definition, if I call somebody a pig, denotatively I'm calling them a farm animal. Connotatively, it's what I'm implying, that they're messy, they're sloppy, they eat a lot, maybe I think they're sexist, things like that. Abstraction, there's a lot of information in the chapter that deals with abstraction, particularly the ladder, abstraction ladder, which has to do with a progression from specificity to the very abstract. And framing theory and how that affects how we understand things. And that's all in your book. Strategic ambiguity is the idea that sometimes it's deliberate to be ambiguous and it's effective to be ambiguous. Equivocation is the way we backpedal words. Euphemisms, how we come up with other words, like nobody's a garbage collector, they're a sanitation engineer. Even a housewife I've heard called a domestic engineer. And so we simply come up with other words, euphemisms. Factors affecting verbal symbols. This is a big list. There's a lot under in here. Certainly your culture, your ethnic background affects your use of language. Not only how you use it, but how important it is to you. There are some ethnic groups where the oral tradition is alive and well. Several colleagues of mine in the doctoral program were studying tribal languages in Africa and how legends or tribal history had long been conveyed through oral traditions, and so it strongly affected their use and their ability, their value of language. Symbolic interactionism, how we create meaning. Linguistic determinism, linguistic relativity, and Sapir-Whorf hypothesis all go together. Has a lot to do with language affecting your worldview. I attached a pamphlet from the Linguistic Society of America that I think is extremely interesting, speaks directly to this issue, and I ask for your reactions to that attachment later on. in the learning unit. And then codability is discussed as well. Sex and gender, the idea that sex is obviously your male or female, gender more being the social norms that go with this. The idea of a two-culture theory is to view them as two separate cultures, and so therefore they have two separate rules, two separate interpretations, two separate norms, two separate value systems, and use language differently because they are two cultures. Interesting research along that idea. Generation has to do with age affecting language use, context. If you have a different vocabulary that you use in the locker room, a different vocabulary that you use in church, a different vocabulary that you use in school, then obviously you've experienced contextual implications and rules on language. To some degree, we all do a little bit of that. On the dark side of verbal language, sort of the downside, static evaluation is when you say John is disrespectful. Not John is being disrespectful right now, but John just is disrespectful. That's called static evaluation. Polarization is when you view the world in extremes. It's either, you know, black and white, and you know, it's this either so extreme. Rectification has to do with how we respond to the label rather than what's going on itself. There are times that there are some words that are so inflammatory that we are responding to the label itself rather than really grasping the message that's what's beyond that. That doesn't necessarily excuse the use of that particular verbal symbol, but it causes a lot of reaction. Muting as the idea that there's some language that just sort of lets things just go undealt with, unresponded, and just another way to look at it. Other things with dark side is a lot of the isms, sexism, racism, homophobic language. I've heard of ageism, you know, being another one, and again, things you want to avoid, you know. On the bright side, confirmation. You can use language in a way to build up and to support other people, and you can also use language in such a way as to dehumanize or to devalue such another person. And I suppose that's particularly on the bright side is because ultimately it's your choice on how you use your language and the effects that you want to have on people. And there's so much work, so much great information we can go into on this alone with the idea of confirmation and disconfirmation. That comes from a lot of the work of a scholar by the name of Jack Gibbs, who in the 1950s came out with these different dimensions of confirmation and disconfirmation that have been validated again and again. And even though the research is dated, it's so profound and relevant. Choices for improving your verbal communication. Certainly the better able you are to be empathetic, to cultivate respect for the other people's viewpoint, the more important it is, the more that will reflect in your use of language. Own your own thoughts, your own feelings. Don't ever say, you make me so mad. You make me feel, you. Don't ever do that, because when you do, you're immediately going to put that person on the defensiveness. Again, that ties back into that disconfirmation we talked about. And then in feeling defensive, typically people then escalate the conflict and attack back. And then what you've done is you've created a spiral that will grow, just grow. But if you say, I feel disrespected, or I feel very frustrated when you do this, but it's I feel, and it's that ownership, and people they can't argue with how you feel or how you respond, and so the I versus the you is very important. Understanding the ladder of abstraction, that when you say toothpaste, you have in your mind Crest, but somebody else is thinking something else. The more specific you are, the better. And indexing and the idea of probing the middle ground and finding the evaluation and asking the questions and the feedback. So that's all we'll do for now. So it's about 10 minutes for this, but we'll jump into a whole lot of other stuff. Enjoy the chapter, dive deep, and see you online.